Welcome everybody to the webinar this afternoon. We'll be covering the new features that released earlier this week in release 16. So I'll take you through the new features and show you some of the things you can do with them now. First thing to probably draw your attention to, all the new features are visible on our documentation portal, which you can get to from the help button up at the top of the site. And if you scroll right along to the far right hand side under release notes, there's a list here of all the new features. So I'll take you through some of the new things that are in here this afternoon, and when we get to the end, if there are any questions, we can take questions and I can dig deeper and show you anything that I may have overlooked. So the first thing to probably mention is that we now support Google transaction receipt validation. So we have always supported Apple and Amazon receipt validation, but we didn't have Google for quite a while because of something to do with the way they handled their the security and the public-private keys. But we do now support Google transaction validation. The way you get to it, there's two pieces to the equation if you want to use this. The first piece, on your dashboard, if you go to your game account, the first piece of the equation is you need to tell us your public key into your Google Play account. So for example, on our demo game, if I go to the Edit Game Details page, and then I go into the Revenue Validation tab, you'll see a slot there now for entering your Google RSA public key. This will be visible in your Google Play console if you don't know where to find that. And the other piece to the equation is in your transaction events. So if I go back into this game and I go into my event manager, there always were two slots in the event management section for transaction validation. Those were the transaction receipt slot and the transaction server. There is now an additional parameter on transaction events that you need to add if you want to track Google revenue, and the new one is a transaction receipt signature. And essentially what you do is you fill in the transaction receipt and transaction receipt signature and send them to us, and we'll validate that revenue. The best place to get information about that probably is in the documentation on either the Android SDKs or the Unity SDK. So if I'll show you where to find that, and I'll show you kind of what it looks like. Down in the transaction section, here we go, there's now a section that explains the Google receipt validation. So there's your public key going in, and your transaction or part of the transaction event will now look something like that, with a transaction server, receipt, and a receipt signature. What happens when we validate the receipt? It's a server-to-server receipt validation. And what we do is we will inject a revenue validated flag onto your transaction event, and that will contain one of the following values. A 0 if we haven't performed any revenue validation, 1 if you passed, 2 if it failed, and 3 if for some reason the validation service was unavailable. So that's how we validate your revenue. And what actually happens in your dashboard and charts, what you'll see is only revenue that either we've not attempted to validate because it's been switched off, or that has passed validation will show up in your revenue charts. Anything that fails or we were unable to validate will not show up. But you can dig into the data in more detail in any of the analyze tools to actually then, if you want to actually isolate the failed transactions and look at who they were, what they were doing, what country they were from, or any of those sorts of things. So the data is still there, it's just we'll exclude the revenue numbers from your revenue charts. And that kind of leads me quite neatly onto the next thing I wanted to show you, because one of the next things we've updated in this release is the data mining tool. And it's actually saying that we've updated it is almost a bit of an understatement. The new data mining tool is a complete replacement for the old one. And this new data mining tool lets you type in SQL into the panel, run it, and get a table of results back. And bang, just like that, nice and quick. So this, as always, is running against your raw event data in the Vertica Analytics database, like all the other analyze tools. And you can do quite a lot of powerful stuff with it now. You can now run SQL from within the platform without having to use a third party or an external tool in direct access. There are certainly times where you'll still want to do that. You'll still want to use a third party tool in direct access, but sometimes for just running quick ad hoc queries in the interface, this is going to be good. So the kind of things you can do in here, you can load queries. You can type in queries just from scratch, and we'll have a play with that in a minute or two. You can load queries that you've saved already, and I should be in the live environment to show you this rather than in the development environment. A bit more data from it. So we've got saved queries in here. I can also look at any of my player segments I've set up and see what they look like. So let's look at auto-generated whales segment. This is our players who have spent more than $100. So I can load any of my segment criteria in and just run them. And I can also load in any saved slice and dice queries and see what they look like. So there's a mission funnel one. Just load it in and run it. The table on the right here, this doesn't actually do anything. It's really just a legend. So if you can't remember what particular parameters are called or what type they are, you can use this to scroll around and just double check your parameter naming. And just like direct access, you have access to your event table. You also have access to the user metrics table in here, and we show you all the user metric parameter names as well. So I think you're going to really like this. We can also you can save any queries you write in here, and you can export them as CSVs as well. So really powerful, good fun. Let's have some fun. Let's do something with it. There's something else I want to show you in a minute or two. So we'll start here and kind of lead into it gently. Let's start writing a query. What I want to look at is I'm going to retrieve some transactions events from the last couple of days and drill into them to show you a feature that we've souped up in Slice and Dice in a minute or two. So let's just select some events from so we're going to look for just the event name equal to transaction and event date greater than current date minus 7. So it's just going to bring back stuff in the last 7 days. Generally, when I'm starting to build up queries and check them, I'm going to reduce the number of rows right down, so I can limit the number of rows here. So it means I can play around and check them without having to pull back tons of results. So that's trying to drag back the full event row. I'll limit that in a little minute or two. So you can see it's pulled back all those. So let's say it's just the real money transactions we're interested in. And it's only when the player was spending money, transact. And I don't want to take the whole row. There's just a couple of things I want to pull out of this. I want to pull out the real currency type and the real currency amount. So if I run that now, it's just coming back with some real currency types and real currency amounts for 10 random transaction events that happened at some point in the last week. The reason I showed you this was to show you something in the way the data is structured. When you send your real currency amounts to us, you send us them in cents. You send in an integer in the lowest currency unit for whatever currency your player is spending. There is, if you may already know this, but we run a currency conversion on your events as they arrive. So we will convert all your transaction events into a common currency for all your display. So if I wanted to see what the converted product amount is, that will contain the value translated into whatever your currency is. So in this case, in fact, all the currencies are being spent in US dollars and we want it displayed in US dollars. That's why this is the same. But what I'm going to show you next is one of the new features in Slice and Dice. We can actually do something quite interesting with that rather than displaying it just as an integer. So I'll move down to Slice and Dice and show you some of the new things it can now do. The first one I wanted to show you is we have always had the capability to derive dimensions, like create new dimensions as derived dimensions. So in your dimensions panel, you can look at just the column values. You can build counters out of things, but we have derived dimensions. One of the new things we've got in release 16 is we can now create derived measures as well. So rather than just looking at an aggregate, let's look at a derived measure, and let's look at the sum of the converted product amount, which from the last query you saw was an integer, and let's now divide that by, we could derive it by another measure, but this time let's put in a value here, divide that by 100 and give it a friendly name. Total revenue in US dollars. We'll add that in and now add that into my query and stick the event date on the other axis and sort that by the date. So we get the dates ascending and run it. And you can now see we have managed to create a derived measure out of the sum of the total converted product amount. So that's derived measures. Some of the other things that you can do in the new Slice and Dice that are very, very cool is we can now look at stacked charts. So before, what you'll know before was we could always do stacking on the measures. So if I look at total real currency, and let's just put something random in here. Let's look at the number of unique users every day as well. We always were able to stack both those things, but we couldn't stack the dimensions before. Now we can. So if let me take that unique users back out of there and do something a bit more interesting. Let's look at the platform these players were playing on when they were spending that money every day. So if I scroll down and find the platform dimension and run that. Now this is right. I've done this wrong, and this is good. This shows what it would have looked like before release 16, where it was grouping. It was doing a group by, and putting the date and the platform and giving them each a separate entry on the axis. When you choose to stack by dimension, it's actually the new feature in release 16. It's giving you an option now to choose which of the dimensions you want to stack. So in this case, we're going to choose platform because we want the event date along the x-axis and the platform stacked with the revenue. So if I rerun that now, bingo, we now have stacked dimensions. So I can see the total revenue each day and the distribution of that revenue across the different platforms the players are playing on. And that applies across all dimensions. So it seems like a really simple, small piece of functionality, but that alone actually starts unlocking an awful lot of new chart types that you can build that you couldn't build before. And of course, because it's a slice and dice query, you can save it and then populate that into a custom dashboard as well. The next area of new functionality to show you is the funnels. We have added some new tools to the funnels. The first and one of the biggest things that you'll be delighted to hear is you can now export your funnels to CSVs. So let me just load up a funnel and run it. So we now have, you probably actually noticed that this toolbar this is the kind of common management toolbar across all the Analyze tools. Its design has changed a little bit and is now kind of more consistent across all the tools. And one of the buttons that you'll see in all of them now is this new export button. So if I hit that, it will export my funnel as a CSV so I can open it elsewhere. Other new features in here, we've added in a termination event at the end, so you can select an event and any parameters to act as a termination event, and that will stop a player progressing any further on in the funnel. Other things we've done to the funnel, you always could add steps at the end, which was all well and good, but invariably you would find yourself creating funnels, and sometimes if you're creating long funnels and you missed a step or wanted to come back later and add a step, that was not possible. But now we can move, as well as adding steps at the end, we can now add steps into the middle of funnels. So if I want to add a step in here between 2 and 3, or sorry, between 3 and 4, I can hit at the plus button and add a new step in. And I can change the priority of steps by hitting the up and down arrows on them, resequence my funnels, and that should save you some time. The other thing we've done, you probably spotted there's another panel in here. We can now set up time limits between event steps in a funnel. So if you want to limit the time between steps for qualification, you can. The kind of places you might want to do this, a typical example might be if you're setting up a funnel on, say, a user purchase flow, and maybe you want to track when the user enters a store, selects a product page, hits the buy button, hits the confirm button, registers a transaction, and then closes a store. If you wanted to make sure that the transaction event actually related to this, exactly this store interaction, you might put a time limit of, say, 3 or 4 minutes between the purchase confirmation click and the transaction event to make sure that you weren't perhaps picking up somebody who's entered the store but they then make a transaction 7 days later or something like that. So that's the kind of a user case when you might want to use that. So that's the extensions to the funnel tool. The next thing, and probably the final thing I'm actually going to talk about today, is the custom dashboards, because there's a couple of tweaks on custom dashboards as well. So if I go and let me open up one of my custom dashboards. So here's a custom dashboard loading. One of the things we've done to custom dashboards, we've changed some of the session handling behind the scenes on the platform. So custom dashboards will now automatically refresh every 15 minutes, and the session length has been extended so it's less likely to log you out. And you can see here we've got a little text message up at the top here telling me when this was refreshed. So if you put this into full screen mode and leave it running, you'll see it updating every 15 minutes or so. One of the other things we've done to custom dashboards is to give you controls on the privacy or public visibility of different dashboards. So you see I've now got a public-private button up the top here. At the moment, this particular dashboard is public. It's open to everybody. Everyone can see it. But if I were to click on this, and I'll not do it because this is a demo account and everybody in the world can see it. If I click this button, everyone in the world's email addresses will come up. So I'll not click it just for now, but if you do click it, you can then select which users have access to this dashboard, and whether it's displayed on the navigation page will be determined by that visibility. And as always, of course, you can set custom dashboards up to be delivered to email recipients at regular intervals if you want. And the other thing just to mention that I probably should have mentioned, the new direct access, new data mining. At the moment, it is just a table display within the data mining tool, but our plans are in the next kind of wave of updates that we'll be adding visualization tools to it, so you can then have your raw SQL queries and paste them onto custom dashboards and have a visualization of your raw SQL in there too. So that's a kind of a sneaky heads up on one of the things we're going to be working on towards the next release. So I hope you found that exciting and interesting, and I think although this was billed as some improvements and updates, there's a couple of things in there are actually some pretty significant improvements that we hope will make your life a lot better and a lot easier, and yeah, kind of open up some more power in the platform. The one thing I've just noticed is not on my list. Some of the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed in direct access, if you are running your own SQL queries in external tools, up and before Tuesday, you had access to your events tables and your user metrics tables. But the more eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed that you now have access to a bunch of extra tables that you didn't have before. So if I go into the documentation site and go to the direct SQL page, there's a little legend here showing me what those tables are. Basically, the new tables that we're giving you access to are some of the aggregated data tables that drive your measure dashboards. So you can now, if there are charts in your measure dashboard area that you kind of like but would like to modify a little bit, you can now do that in direct access by accessing the tables that underpin this data. And the data you've got access to in there, I'll just quickly jump back once this page loads. The tables you've got in there are all these ones that are prefixed with fact, and what you've got in there are weekly active user counts, monthly active user counts. There is tables covering the event types, the missions, and the products that people are buying. Also, the user sessions. The most useful of these tables is probably the user sessions one. That's got quite a lot of aggregated dimensions in it, and you'll see there's two copies of each table, so you get your dev environment and live environment versions of each table. So by all means, have a look in there. They'll start opening up some other query types that you maybe didn't have access to before. So that's pretty much everything I've got to show you today on the new release. And if there are any questions, Louise and I will be able to hopefully answer any questions you might have.
Great, thanks Laurie. Does anybody have any questions just now, or has Laurie covered it all off this afternoon? What we'll also do is make a recording of the webinar available, so if you want to share it with any colleagues or you want to revisit any parts of it, you can do so. It's also worth mentioning that we do take into account a lot of client feedback and suggestions on the platform. So if there's any recommendations or anything you would like to see in the platform in the near future, just let us know, and we can add it to the discussions. I think there's a question that's just come in.
Yep, I can see that. I'm just having a think about it. Can you demonstrate a way to simplify the time spent per session using the new features and slice and dice? So this is quite a good one. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think on my feet with this, but I think let's dive straight in and see what we can do. So The time per session is going to be typically, let's just think. So if I go into my users table, in here I've got a couple of metrics for every user. I've got the total sessions played and I've got the total time played, but unfortunately time played is in milliseconds. So it sounds like we've got an excellent candidate here for creating a derived measure, which is the time in milliseconds divided by the number of sessions. And I could actually demonstrate a nice trick on that, because with derived measures you can in fact create derived measures of derived measures. So let's do that by looking at, we'll create a derived measure that's the average session length in milliseconds, and then we'll derive a further measure of that that turns it into minutes rather than milliseconds. So let's start off by putting let's just put the event date across the x-axis, or how are we going to do this? Let's start up here. This could go horribly wrong because I really shouldn't think and talk at the same time, but we'll see how we get on. Let's create a derived dimension, which is, no, I'm going to need to do it in measures. So create a derived measure. Have I already got a sum of the total time played in milliseconds divided by, where are we? So I think I'm going to need to add total sessions. Yeah, I need to add a total sessions one. So let's have a dimension aggregate based on total sessions played, and that's going to be sum and let's create a derived dimension of that. So there's my sum of the total sessions and my sum of the time. And I'm going to put average session length in milliseconds. And let's create a new derived dimension. And we'll take our average session length in milliseconds, and we're going to divide that by 60,000. So divide that by a constant of 60,000, and remember to give it a name. Average session length in minutes. And let's see, let's just take a couple, I could go a lot further with this, but just to kind of double check what we've done, let's just do that. This is potentially going to try and return millions of users, so it's not, I probably would want to aggregate that further, but it'll let us see some user IDs and the number of their average session length, and let's just put the total number of sessions in there as well, just to see what it comes back with. And I wonder, could we do anything? What's going to happen if we try and sort like that? I'm wondering, what I want to see is are the players who have played a lot of sessions? Yes, it looks like the ones that played a lot of sessions have got a far longer session length So it looks like that is probably doing what we're trying to do there. Because this is a demo data set, the data is slightly artificial. But it looks like it's trying to do what we intended. So hopefully that's one way of doing that. There are probably some other ways as well. Any other questions before I go and have a lie down after having to think that hard?
There's not any more at the moment, but
Oh,
if anybody has any questions following the webinar, just get in touch with Laurie or I, or via support, and we'll come back to you. But yeah, thank you, Laurie. That was very helpful, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.